Is reform inevitable? This week, Chris Bayliss and I talk whether reform will be a lasting prospect and what the real threat they pose to traditional party politics is. Welcome to The Critic. Welcome to the first edition of the Critic video podcast. I'm joined today by noted Critic contributor Chris Bayliss. Chris, how are you?
I'm very well indeed, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad, thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Very exciting.
So the reason I wanted to ask you on today is that we've both been writing about reform a lot recently. Mm-hmm. And in August, you did a piece for The Critic Online called Is Reform Inevitable? And so my first question is it?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem any less inevitable than it felt back in August. I think that period that I described of the party constantly leading the polls and constantly being above 30%, and none of the others coming anywhere near close, has continued. And I think that that certainly Farage and the party leadership have made a number of fairly bold and eye-catching interventions and policy announcements since then. There have been a number of high-profile defections. And I think there was a feeling earlier on in the summer that there was a lot of energy happening on the right of British politics, a lot of popular energy that the party wasn't quite keeping up with. And it almost felt for the first time like they were being outpaced. I think that there feels less of that at the moment, and it feels like they're back making the agenda. Mm-hmm. But I still think that the fundamental issue that I described in that piece, which is that we've got a long way to go until the election. We're already used to them now leading substantially in the polls. That poll lead is gonna become part of the furniture. People are going to become a lot more comfortable with the idea of reform, and there's this risk of a drift into blandness that I think remains a threat for them and that they have to consider, given that they are going to have to do an awful lot of very bold, very controversial things once they're in office that are going to be difficult to do if they don't have that momentum and that energy before the next election.
So you think there's a danger of them going back to the situation of last summer where you were talking about the energy on the right, and I presume you mean Bobby Jenrick, basically?
No, not well. I think that was part of it, but I think there's this feeling that the right is really shifting the debate after years while the Conservatives were in power, in which people were talking about shift in new ideas, particularly around border security and immigration, and that the reality of the Conservatives in government were just a blockage to that. Now, in opposition, and completely in opposition, the right can dare to dream. And I think there was a sense that Mr. Farage felt uncomfortable about a lot of the stuff that was being talked about. Mm-hmm. But you also had the Conservatives, elements within the Conservative Party being a lot more ambitious in terms of their comms, coming out with some interesting stuff on a variety of things. I think back to Jenrick's stuff about tool theft and things like that. Mm-hmm. But no, I think what I was talking about more is the sense in which people just get used to this idea of a reform government, and you get the kind of people that the party is going to attract. First of all, it's going to, in terms of social ability, social acceptability. Yeah. You can already feel it, the tendrils drifting up through the middle classes, and they're going to, in the bits of the professional upper middle classes now, among whom the party is still basically anathema. I don't think that's going to be the case in a year or so's time. And I think you're going to get an awful lot of people who are perhaps interested in the idea of becoming an MP, who hadn't considered it before, and who are going to start identifying with reform as a vehicle for that. And these aren't people who are, to some extent, they're not political at all. And in a way that kind of suits reform. It's a party for normal apolitical people. But the stuff that they're going to have to do is inherently political. It's inherently controversial. And looking at the people that it's going to start bringing with them, are they going to become a barrier when, in a couple of years' time, the party has to start talking about some really serious things and changes that they're going to make? And you've got this sort of set of regional tier property developers and ex-television presenters and the variety of other kind of the sort of middle management
Tory
type
candidates. Yeah.
Well, it's your words, not
not that I include myself in that, of course.
Well, you were very successful, but I think that this kind of the party needs to. Farage's instincts, after all his years in politics, push him toward agreeability, not frightening the horses. He knows where he's got a sense of where he feels that he needs to be in order to attract that median voter.
Yeah.
And there's a danger that the party loses its radical edge, and they're geared toward that to some extent. They're geared. I mean, if you look just the sort of the mint green color scheme, it feels very corporate. It feels a little bit bland, and to some extent, you can see why they're doing that, and you see the strategy of making the party feel less threatening to more middle of the road voters. But it needs to retain that radical dynamism, because it's going to have to do some pretty radical things, or it's going to fail as badly as Sunak and Boris and all the rest of them.
Yeah, list here. I would disagree slightly with your description of their aesthetic as corporate. I think it's very, very, very daytime TV.
Yes.
And actually that makes sense because they've got a couple of former daytime TV stars there now.
Yeah.
David Bull was on something to do with ghosts, I think. Or was he a medical show? And then they've got Jeremy Kyle, who's now a member as well. He was at the conference. And I think Kyle
might be more interesting, actually.
I think Kyle is definitely angling to become MP, right? He has to be, because otherwise, why would you? He's never been involved in politics before, really. No. But I think they have a very, very strong daytime TV aesthetic. And I always think of that awful moment at their conference where Andrea Jenkins comes out and sings her own song in a full body sequin dress. That's very, very, very camp and kitsch. And I think that rather than speaking to a corporate identity, I think that speaks to a lot of their voters. And this is something you pick up in your August piece. Their voters, their supporters are basically people who don't really think about politics and are quite happy to do politics as almost a spectator sport. And I think you drag out that's quite an unusual new phenomenon. Yeah. And I think the daytime TV aesthetic feeds into that because it makes it much easier for people who don't think a lot about politics and to kind of go, oh, well, I might vote Reform because that, what's the boxer's name? Luke, the candidate for Hull. He's the mayor of Hull now. If you get more mainstream figures, it provides a much stronger connection to people who don't think about politics and have no involvement in politics because you're bringing in figures that they know, even if it's only from daytime TV. Yeah,
on the one hand, I think that the kind of median voter that Reform's going for are the last people to watch daytime TV. If you look at them, and it's one of a couple of interesting contradictions in terms of how the party is moving. One is that you can see that they're really trying to go for people working in the real economy, people running small businesses, people in manufacturing, and outside of the metropolitan bubble. But after 30 years of playing the kind of political game that he's played, it almost seems that the only people that Nigel Farage really knows are people in that kind of media world, because that's how he's played the game, and that's what he's had to do to get himself noticed. And as he's looking for people to, he doesn't really have those connections in industry anymore, to the extent that he did. So there's that strange trade-off, and it does become this sort of media product. But yeah, I think a lot of people who normally join and get involved in political parties are people who are intensely interested in politics. And I think the one thing that, and I referenced this in the piece in August, was the one thing that really does make Nigel Farage the sort of everyman that the people who hate him insist that he cannot be, is that he shares the sort of average bloke's distrust of people who are too interested in politics. in terms of the drama and and also to some extent the nitty-gritty of policy. But he's got now this party of people who've signed, well, and the sort of ambiguity over the party's status.
Yeah, whether it's a private company or a political party.
You've got a lot of people who are happy to put their name down, pay their fees, and then leave the actual governance of the party to the people, to the shareholders of what still remains a company. But because there's been this reluctance to engage too heavily in policy, that sort of the showbiz and the drama and the who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down of party politics is sort of all that's all that's going on up until the last couple of months, where there have been these sort of very dramatic announcements and events on immigration, and more recently the stuff that he's been talking about on the economy as well.
Yeah. So you touched on the kind of Farage's natural dislike of the establishment. And I think, do you think that poses a long-term or even a medium-term quite a big problem for him? I'm thinking of Zai Yusuf at The Spectator Drinks. Mm-hmm. Not that we should mention rival lesser publications anyway, but so he went to the drinks, and if you remember, he actually said something that I think will go down quite well with reform voters, and he thanked the assembled members in the room for making their life so much easier because they were so incompetent as a political establishment. Now, like people like my parents, who are, you know, a fairly median reform voter, absolutely loved that. They thought it was fantastic, and here's another Nigel Farage type sticking the knife in. But obviously that's quite alienating to a large segment of the establishment. Mm-hmm. Do you think that poses that kind of skepticism towards the establishment, which I think, to be fair, is well deserved given what they've done? Do you think that poses a kind of medium, short-term problem for him poaching people across who are going to staff his government? Or can he pull enough people out from, let's say, industry, daytime TV, to kind of form a coherent government? Or is he going to be stuck with basically, you know, the candidate pool which he's got now, which is failed, rejected Tory candidates and, you know, eternal malcontents?
Yeah, I think Zia Yusuf is quite easily the most interesting character that they've got there. There's clearly quite a few people from the Tory side of politics who've met him and who find him competent and sincere in terms of what he believes. And I think there were, on sort of the dissident, malcontented right, there were a lot of people who were and remain very sceptical about him, that he sort of bought his way into the party and he's there for a lack of any other ideas, and that he appears to have this sort of hold on Nigel Farage's ear. I think certainly over the last couple of months, I think we've seen why Farage values him. He's as a media performer, he's clearly good. Yep. He's clearly got a policy brain, and he seems to be genuinely committed to the ideas that he's coming out with.
He's become a bit of a Swiss Army man for reform recently, hasn't he? He seems to be on everything that they're doing.
Yeah, because I mean, at the moment, and this is part of the issue, is that obviously it became a bit of a cliche to say about Farage that his ego couldn't bear sharing the limelight. And I don't think that's necessary. It's not an unusual thing in terms of that kind of politician.
Oh, I don't like sharing this limelight with you.
And he's but this is the thing with it, is I don't know. So in terms of The Spectator and the event the other week, I don't think that'll do any harm at all. Because obviously that event's always been a bit of a Mickey take. I remember Theresa May dressing up in high vis and a hard helmet to go and see to stick the knife one last time into George Osborne, sort of shortly after she'd become Prime Minister and his political career appeared to be over. And no, there's always been that element of cattiness. And if anything, that almost seems like him trying to become part of that little group. It's sort of, he's sharing an in-group joke with them. I don't think that Reform supporters will notice that. I think they'll be, as you say, I think they'll be delighted with that kind of thing if they even became aware of it. And I'm not sure to the extent to which the average Reform supporters particularly noticed him yet. Obviously, he's popped up in various things.
Yeah,
you've got an awful lot of people who are into, well, who are considering voting for reform, who somebody will pop up to make an announcement on one of their things, and they won't feel the need to go and Google them or sort of say, "Oh, who's he?" He's just somebody that they've got out saying things. But I think he'll become more of a staple of it. And no, I don't. I think that there's going to be this increasing pull of, and I think that it's almost going to become a concern for them. How many ex-Conservatives do they want in positions of responsibility? They've already got, well, at least a couple who I think are going to be a serious liability for them. Nadine Dorries is the obvious one.
I couldn't get over that appointment.
Really, it was, and obviously
they had to slap her down twice in the following 2 days.
Yeah.
Once they had to issue some kind of rebuke over the Online Safety Act because she had defended it, and they've come out and said they're going to repeal it. And then the second time, obviously, Nadine Dorries did what Nadine Dorries was always going to do, which was make it about Boris Johnson and say he should unite the right. And they quite rightly said, why? No. Get lost.
Well, and I think there's, I mean, I don't know. I think there's got to be at least a 25% chance, if not higher, that Boris tries something in the next 4 years. And obviously somebody like her is going to have to back that.
Yeah.
She can do no other. And if they are pitching themselves as the anti-Tories, and this is the culmination of a decades-long effort by Farage and his sort of closest group of friends to finally stick the nail in the coffin of the Tory party, why? I mean, surely there's got to be an element of risk of just filling it up. Yes, obviously it's fun to get the scalps and get the defections.
Yeah.
But there are other places that they can look for, talent. The media's possibly one, and I think they need to be careful about how heavily they fish in those waters.
Yeah. I think they're probably at their limit with the media, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think given with the fact that Labour are in power and raising a lot of concerns about their prevalence on things like GB News, and also you've got Talk TV, who have a lot of presenters who are reform aligned as well. I think they're probably at their limit with the media, if I'm being honest. I'm not sure how much deeper they can go. I mean, maybe they can kind of poach some people who are a bit like, I don't know, Jeremy Kyle before he started doing the political stuff. But beyond that, I'm really not sure. That
all I can think of with it, obviously Jeremy Kyle's a very different character, but all I can think of is Kilroy Silk. And
before my time, unfortunately.
Well, there's a wonderful clip actually of a very young Keir Starmer appearing on his show from about 1991.
It's about raving, right?
It's about raving,
yes.
And Starmer, and Kilroy Silk says, "Well, do you go? Oh, I don't go to rave. I don't burgle houses either. I stick up for burglars." And you forget what a rabble the average episode of that show really was. But still, obviously, Kilroy Silk then later became part of UKIP and led UKIP for a while.
Yeah, and then became another Farage casualty.
And there is this risk with people like that who, I mean, going on television, doing things like that, it appeals to people with a certain personality type, and that personality type comes with liabilities.
Yeah.
And so, there's a limit to how they go. Obviously, there's business, and the issue you've got there is that there's an awful lot of people in the private sector, particularly in the corporate sector, who are... They've done real things. I mean, compared to the average person who's worked their way up through sort of bag carrying and politics, they've actually done real things. They've been in charge of sort of lots of zeros and signing things off and building things. And they sort of think that they can do everything. They can do anything. Yeah. And that politics doesn't quite work like that. And there are some unhappy stories of, and I think Richard Tice is an interesting example. Clearly a man, by all accounts, very successful as a property developer, and Brexit Party / Reform wouldn't have got off the ground without his money. And if you wanted sort of somebody to go and do something, I think out of the people that are there, Tice is probably the person that you'd pick to sort of go and manage something. But as a politician, he doesn't quite work. He's really limited. He doesn't have Farage's instinctive common touch with the voters that he's trying to appeal to. I watched a speech he gave at Bloomberg recently, and that was, like you say, on going to do something on the exact numbers. I think it was the pre-launch of their tax plan, or talking about working on a tax plan.
he really knew his stuff in a way that I think beyond a couple of Tory chancellors, I would struggle to name people in the Tory party that I would think could give that speech. I mean, obviously somebody like Rishi could have done it.
Yeah.
But as a leader, I think I wrote a piece for the Critic when Tice was still leader, so God knows when that was. Just saying, actually, they were languishing at 10%. The Tories were knocking on death's door, and what they needed was competent leadership to get them back up to, finishing the Tories off, if that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think now they've got it. And he's a competent doer to go and squirrel away. And I've started to see people like him coming up.
My theory about him is that over the course of his business career, he'd obviously had so many conversations basically bollocking people for not hitting their numbers or just generally bungling something. And that's the reality of life in business. It's certainly businesses like that. But that would almost become his default conversational style.
Yeah.
And I almost occasionally you'd sort of watch an interview with him, and there'd be a moment where he was looking directly to the camera, and you were sort of there, and I could feel that my palms starting to sweat as if I was back in Lloyd's, sort of being summoned before a stern underwriter for something, and so there's an awful lot of talent across the British economy in different places, but I think the point is that there are various ponds to fish in, none of which can be fished in too heavily. So you've got the Tory party, media, business. The other area potentially is Americans, and people from elsewhere and whatever. Not for frontline political roles, but in terms of the backroom policy expertise. Obviously, the way the American system works, there's an abundance of talent being used and sort of being kept on the sidelines where it's not needed. Potentially that's another area that they can look at for backroom staff and policy thinking to sort of replace the kind of function that the Tories had for a while with Linton Crosby. And that kind of thing, I think. But again, you don't want to do it a bit, not too much.
And they're fishing in American waters already very heavily. So I know, it's become a cliche to talk about Project 2025, but they are using that as something of a blueprint. They want to go into government with a set plan of what they're going to do, and ideally a big list of people who are going to do it, and they are just going to drop people in. And I think that, interestingly, extends to the cabinet as well. So they've already indicated that they're basically going to bring the cabinet in from the Lords, which I think is probably the right thing to do. But you're right. I think they can use Americans a little bit, but I think that speaks to their talent paucity problem.
Well, obviously, you have to take a step back and just think how remarkable their position is at the moment. We have never been in this situation where, obviously, we've got a party now leading in the polls for a substantial period of time. They look pretty likely certainly to become the largest party and most probably to form a single party government.
Can't you argue this has happened before with David Steele, though? Go back to your constituencies and prepare for government.
Yeah, but how long were they leading in the polls for? I don't know. It was a matter of months, and it was
probably not as long as Reform.
You got there. You got in place a government that was, it was unpopular, but it was a force to be reckoned with. And I'm not sure to the extent that people, how much people really bought it. Did people really believe it? I think people thought that they'd do a lot better than they did. But there's nothing like Michael Foot, let alone Margaret Thatcher on the scene at the moment. And I think, I think you can make the comparison to where they were before Galtieri threw Mrs. Thatcher her lifeline. But obviously,
did us a real solid.
Obviously the economy was already improving by that point anyway, and she wouldn't have been obliged to call an election until 1984, by which time it was doing really rather well. But that aside, you've got now, there are 5 of them in Parliament. Even the Labour Party, as they were coming up in the early, but by the time that they'd formed their first government, they'd been a presence in Parliament for nearly 20 years, and they had been the official opposition.
Yeah, they'd got hands.
So it's quite, I would definitely imagine them making a lot of use of sort of the law, and I wonder whether they might consider some form of innovation in terms of people not, well, the Lords give such a get out because you can literally just put anybody in there.
Yeah.
But
and we do regularly.
Whether there'll be more of whether they might sort of alternate styles and maybe get rid of the restriction that all ministers have to be members of the legislature one way or the other.
I think a move to an American system would be far, far, far better. I think the Prime Minister should be able to choose the best person for the job who will serve, not the best person for the job who's currently on the benches of the House of Commons. Because the problem is the talent going into the House of Commons has just collapsed. And we do need to find a way to bypass that. And I think the only way I can think to bypass it is basically to leave the House of Commons, leave them as essentially super councillors.
Yeah. And also it's not just the cabinet and ministers that they're looking at. I mean, I'm assuming stuff is going to start coming out of reform about what they're planning on doing to the civil service. Surely they're not just going to try and keep it as it is and try and a minister, well, a Secretary of State is a lonely job to have. You've got 3, maybe 4 ministers who are not your choice. That's sort of determined by number 10.
Yep.
Then you've got a couple of spadlings who are
just
and they are
60.
They're completely overwhelmed by the amount of stuff. Everybody else you're dealing with is a civil servant. I'm sure they're going to look at trying to open that up. I would imagine that we'd expect them to start looking at the Cabinet Office and the secretariats for cabinet subcommittees. That's going to require finding talent from somewhere, and that's the really interesting thing. And that's that means that's why the Americans have these great big think tanks and these organizations, and that's why they need all that funding is to nurture that talent and to give those people jobs when they're not in power.
Yeah,
and that's the one thing where I think you really could end up looking more American, but then that does leave it leaves reform now with an even bigger headache. Where are we going to find these people?
Yeah,
from?
if you're going to massively expand the talent pool, and you can't currently fill the talent pool you've got, which is basically only, let's give them credit. They've only been an electoral force for a few years.
Yeah.
It's a few hundred, maybe tops out of 1,000 councillors, 5 MPs. Well, they've been through 7, I suppose. So if you're struggling to fill that talent pool and suddenly you want to treble the number of SPADs, which again, I think would be a great idea. I've written for The Critic about this. If you read that Dom Cummins blog about his time with in the Department for Education, you can tell that what the civil service are trying to do is, because there was a reforming agenda with a minister with a positive message who wanted to drive something forward, they were simply trying to derail it with little tactical level decisions, almost coming to them and saying, what colour would you like the light bulbs? And then tactically leaking to throw things off course. And actually you do need, basically, I think, my big constitutional plan for government, which is obviously not going to happen because it's insane, is get rid of number 10, just have meetings and do photo shoots there and base them at County Hall, because I think you need that many people to staff modern government. But again, where are reform going to find that?
Oh no, exactly. And this it speaks to how overly centralised the British state is. The sheer quantity of decision making, and it means that you can drown policymakers in this morass of information. And a lot of this stuff was innovation that Margaret Thatcher brought in to try and deal with the situation. The Cabinet Office right-round system is just an absolute. It's a charter to run the country on autopilot.
And the agentification that then led to lots of NGOs and later on Quangos under Blair.
And they're going to have to seriously think. I mean, the one great unknown is, how many people there are that they could pluck from the civil service who might be amenable to reform, because we really just don't know what that number is, because those people obviously have to keep very quiet. But yeah, I think going back to your original point about the balance that they need to tread in terms of their antics, like Zia, standing up at the Spectator and coming out with stuff like that. What's the balance between appealing to core support and not alienating, not just potentially people coming over from the Tories, but people coming over from business, from sort of more dignified word callings.
So not daytime TV.
No, exactly, and potentially that'll be. But yeah, I think that there's clearly a balance there to be struck. But I think they have the one real advantage that Reform have got is that so much of their support, and I think I run a sort of back home the factory that I'm involved with there, and the lads there. Stories come up, and that might not make sort of. Questions are asked about the capability to govern and how on it are they with the policy, and people will sort of think, yeah, that doesn't quite look good. Tomorrow it's all forgotten and they're back to, God, Reform are doing well in the polls again. It's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something's going to happen. And I think
they're in that sense, they're a very narrative party because they've always been unburdened by the realities of Parliament and power, actually.
Yeah.
So they can just thrive on narrative because that's what Farage has done for his entire career.
And obviously, you can feel how frustrated the Tories are getting with it, because the Tories could come up with anything they wanted. They could come up with the boldest, the most exciting, the most well-worked-out policy proposal, and everybody will just turn around and say, well, why didn't you do that for 14 years? Reform are they're the opposite. They can come out with whatever they want, and still there's this Teflon element, and people, an awful lot of that support base just wants to see both of the main parties get an absolute, thorough and well-deserved shoeing, and they will start thinking about policy and they will start thinking about Reform's competence after they've done that.
Yeah.
And they've almost got a free run at it for the next.
I think the only way for the Tories to outflank Reform is the one thing that Kemi Badenoch is not able to do, which is to move fast.
Mm.
So it was, I'm thinking of the migration policy they brought out that now I think they've now walked back. After it being policy for a month, after her saying when she first came in that there was going to be no policy for 3 years. Not that I'm mad about it. You can outflank Reform if you are first to the punch. And Kemi is never first to the punch because she thinks the key element that sets her apart from Reform is that, you know, they are a serious party. She is a serious politician who thinks about policy seriously. And I just don't think she understands, or her team don't understand, actually that's not the world we live in anymore because of the huge failures of us in government, of the Tories in government. It's not like 1997 where there is no alternative. There is now an alternative, and people want to use that alternative to get rid of the Tories.
Yeah, I think clearly what you can see is that there's obviously a very professional outfit around Kemi. And you've really seen this over the last few months, is that she's starting to look the part of the leader of the opposition. She looks like a serious leader of the opposition. She does the things that a leader of the opposition is supposed to do. And she does them quite convincingly, with the exception of coming up with policy quickly. But she goes through the motions of it. She stands there at the dispatch box and she tells the world how the Prime Minister doesn't have a plan. And she compares what the government's doing unfavourably with the last government, which is the very last thing that anybody wants to hear. Nobody wants to hear the slightest suggestion that the last lot were any better and we'd be better off with them back in. Literally no. And they'd be better off really trying to anything they can do to make people forget at least the last 5 and if not the last 14 years prior to 2024, the better. And they don't seem able to do that. They don't seem able to break out of the mould and to start talking about. They need to start talking about. I mean, Keir Starmer's already stopped sort of launching at the Tories and he goes straight for Reform.
Yeah.
She needs to repay the favour and start going after Blair. She needs to start talking about this generational epoch-defining change that they're going to bring about. That's what people want. People want something that feels a bit like regime change, not a change of government. And the Conservatives at the moment are not offering that. They're offering... I mean, look at the people that they've got in. Some of the people they've got in cabinet are all right. Some of them have done pretty well. But you've got
some
others.
of them you can't name.
That's the end of the free section of the Critic Show, but the conversation goes on. If you'd like to hear the full episode, subscribe at outpoststudios.net.